All right, so are you ready to really get into it today? We're going deep on intelligence.
Ooh, intelligence.
But, and here's the twist, we're looking at it through the eyes of an AI expert who's got some pretty unique ideas about how it all works.
Yeah, the approach that they take is, it's definitely different.
Definitely different, yeah. And it all starts with this analogy about flight.
Oh, yeah, the airplane analogy, right? That's a good one.
So picture this. It's the 1890s, and you've got these scientists, right? They're trying to invent an airplane, and somehow they get their hands on a time machine.
Okay, a time machine, I'm listening.
They travel to the future, right? And they see a Boeing 747 for the first time.
Whoa.
But here's the catch. They only get to examine the passenger cabin.
Oh, so they're seeing the comfy seats, the little tray tables, the windows.
Exactly, and they go back to their own time, convinced that they've cracked the code of flight.
Based on the passenger amenities?
Based on the passenger amenities, they totally missed the crucial parts, right? The engine, the wings, the fuel systems, the stuff that actually makes the plane fly.
Like they see what it looks like, but have absolutely no clue how it works.
Exactly, and this AI expert is saying we might be making the same mistake when it comes to understanding intelligence.
Interesting.
We're so focused on the surface, the things that are easy to see like language and conscious thought, that we're missing the deeper system underneath.
The stuff that's driving it all, right? Like the engine of a plane.
Right. And the expert argues that at its core, intelligence is really all about this fundamental ability to explore.
Okay, exploration. Interesting.
And they break down this ability to explore into 4 key elements that had to evolve, even for the most basic forms of life.
So even for I don't know, a single-celled organism.
Even simpler, they're talking about things like jellyfish and sea anemones.
Wow, okay, so what's the first element then?
The first element is having an internal state.
An internal state, huh?
Meaning a creature needs to be able to sense its own needs, like hunger, thirst, that kind of thing.
So it's got to know what it needs to survive.
Exactly, because that's what motivates it to go out and explore, to find what it needs.
That's actually more complex than it sounds when you really think about it.
Right. Like imagine trying to program a robot to actually feel hunger.
Yeah, that's a whole other level of complexity.
Okay, so internal state, that's the first element. The second is sensory input.
Sensory input, so how a creature perceives the world around it.
Yeah, so sight, smell, touch, taste, hearing, all of that.
Which is interesting because, depending on what a creature's dominant sense is, their whole physical form is different.
Absolutely. Like a bloodhound's nose is perfectly designed for sniffing out scents, whereas a hawk has incredibly sharp vision for hunting.
Okay, so we've got internal state, we've got sensory input. What's next?
This is where it gets even more interesting. Sensory integration.
Sensory integration.
It's not enough to just have senses. Creatures need to be able to combine all that information from different senses into a single coherent picture.
Right, because it's one thing to see something, it's another to smell something, but putting all of that together is a whole other challenge.
Think about it this way. Let's say you're walking in the woods. You hear a rustle in the leaves, you see a flash of color, maybe you smell something musty.
How do you know which signal to pay attention to?
Exactly. That's where a brain, or even a simpler structure like a nerve net in less complex organisms, comes in. It's like the central command center, taking in all that data and making sense of it.
So it filters out the noise and helps the creature focus on what's important.
Exactly. Now that's all still laying the groundwork for exploration.
I can see how all of this is connected, but how do we get from there to something that's actually, intelligent?
Well, that brings us to the fourth element, and it's a big one. Value shifting.
Value shifting, what does that mean?
It basically means that creatures are constantly updating the value they place on things based on their internal state and experiences. So what might be super important one day might be totally meaningless the next. The AI expert actually calls this learning.
Oh, that makes sense. Like a kid who's obsessed with their marble collection one week and then completely forgets about it the next because they're onto trading cards?
Exactly. Our wants and needs change, our social situations change, and all of that influences what we value.
And so it's like our perception of the world is constantly in flux. It's not fixed.
Exactly. And the AI expert argues that this constant reevaluation of what matters to us, that's the essence of learning.
Interesting. So it's not just about memorizing facts. It's about this deeper process of deciding what's important to us based on our experiences.
Exactly. And to really understand how this learning and exploration process works, we need to talk about the role of dopamine.
Ah, dopamine, the brain chemical that everyone always talks about with pleasure and rewards.
Right, but it turns out it plays a much bigger role in all of this than we might think.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about how dopamine fits into all of this. Okay, yeah, so dopamine. Where do we go from here?
So we've got exploration as this foundation for intelligence, right? It's all about those 4 elements we were just talking about.
Internal state, senses, combining those senses, and what is it? Value shifting?
Value shifting, yeah, which the AI expert acquaints with learning. But how do we go from basic exploration to, the complex intelligence that we see in humans?
That's a big jump.
It is a big jump. And the expert suggests that a major step in that direction was the emergence of something called trial and error learning.
Trial and error, huh?
Yeah, so like instead of just reacting to the environment, creatures start actually experimenting. They try different things and see what happens.
Kind of like the scientific method, but on a much more basic level.
Exactly. It's like imagine a young animal learning to hunt. It tries stalking its prey, it tries chasing, it tries ambushing. Through trial and error, it starts to figure out what works best in different situations.
So it's all about learning from experience, right? Refining behavior based on what leads to success and what leads to failure.
Exactly. And this type of learning is like deeply connected to the dopamine system.
Oh, right. Dopamine. So it's not just about pleasure then.
Not just about pleasure, no. It's also about motivation and like the drive to achieve goals.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does dopamine actually fit into this whole trial and error process?
Well, think of it like this. As creatures are experimenting, they're getting feedback from the environment, right?
Right, like if they try something and it works, or if they try something and it, backfires.
Exactly. So if an action leads to something positive, like let's say, catching prey, there's a surge of dopamine.
That feel-good chemical?
Exactly. And that reinforces the behavior, making the creature more likely to try it again in the future.
Oh, so it's like a reward system.
Exactly. And on the flip side, if an action leads to like a negative consequence, like getting injured or something.
Dopamine levels plummet.
Dopamine levels plummet, exactly, signaling that, maybe it's best to avoid that behavior in the future.
Interesting. So it's like this constant interplay of like dopamine spikes and dips, those moments of success and failure that are driving this whole learning and adaptation process.
Exactly. It's how organisms become more efficient, more successful at navigating their world.
That makes you wonder what that feedback loop looks like in the human brain, right? Like how sophisticated does that get?
Right. But trial and error is only like one side of the learning coin, right?
Oh, true. What about learning from others? That seems like a big part of how humans gain knowledge.
Yeah, that's where things get even more interesting. And this is where the expert talks about this next level of learning, which they call vicarious trial and error, or like, learning by watching.
Learning by watching, so like observing others and picking up on what they're doing.
Exactly. It's like, especially for social creatures like humans, we're constantly observing others, picking up cues, imitating behaviors.
I mean, just think about how much we learn from watching our parents, or teachers, even just strangers.
Yeah, like it's incredibly efficient, right? We can learn from other people's experiences without having to actually go through those trials and errors ourselves.
Like we benefit from their mistakes, we benefit from their successes.
Right. And the AI expert argues that this ability to learn vicariously is like one of the most powerful drivers of human intelligence.
I can see that. Like it allows us to adapt and evolve so much faster than if we were just relying on our own individual trial and error.
Right. But what's remarkable is how this also connects back to the dopamine system.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How does learning from others tie into the dopamine? I thought that was more about individual rewards and motivation.
Well, it turns out that like observing other people succeed can actually trigger dopamine release in our own brains.
Whoa, so it's like we're experiencing the reward vicariously.
Exactly. Like we see someone else achieve something, and it sparks this drive in us to do the same.
Wow, that's amazing. Like our brains are literally wired to learn not just from our own experiences, but from the experiences of those around us.
Exactly. And this leads us to what many consider like the pinnacle of human intelligence. Language.
Language, yeah. That feels like such a complex and uniquely human capability.
Right. So how does it fit into this whole evolutionary picture that we've been talking about?
Well, the expert describes language as like the ultimate tool for bridging the gap between our current state and a desired future.
Okay, remember that idea about dopamine being about closing that gap between where we are and where we want to be?
Right, right. So how does language help us do that?
Well, language allows us to communicate these like complex ideas, right? To share our experiences and knowledge with others in a way that goes way beyond just observing behavior.
It's like we can express abstract concepts, we can convey emotions, we can collaborate on a level that wouldn't be possible without language.
It's like taking those concepts of trial and error and vicarious learning and like amplifying them to a whole new level.
It's almost like having a simulator for your mind, right? Like instead of having to physically try every possible outcome, we can use language to explore different scenarios, test ideas, refine our understanding of the world.
And it's interesting how, like, even just the act of thinking and planning, which is made possible by language, can trigger that dopamine response.
Oh, yeah. It's like our brains are constantly seeking that sense of progress and accomplishment, even in the realm of thought.
It's this, like, incredible feedback loop, right? This dance between our innate drives, our experiences, and this powerful tool of language that shapes how we learn, how we adapt, and ultimately, I think, how we define ourselves. Man, this whole deep dive into intelligence has really shifted my perspective. Thinking about it as this long evolutionary journey, starting with simple exploration and leading all the way to language. It's amazing to see how it all fits together.
It is humbling, yeah. I mean, we often think of ourselves as so separate from other life forms, but when you really break down these core elements of intelligence, you see just how much we share, even with creatures as simple as jellyfish.
Makes you realize that intelligence isn't just about having a big brain, right? It's about how organisms interact with their environments, how they learn and adapt to survive.
And speaking of survival, the AI expert actually makes this really interesting point. They suggest that while these systems of intelligence, they evolved for survival, in the modern world, they've kind of shifted towards something they call thrival.
Thriving. I like that. It feels like a more expansive way of looking at those same drives. So it's about more than just staying alive.
Yeah, exactly. It's about flourishing. It's about reaching our full potential as individuals and as a species. It's about creating a life that is meaningful and impactful.
So how do we connect this idea of thrival with the dopamine system and all those other elements we've been talking about? These systems were honed for millions of years with survival as the ultimate goal.
Well, think about it this way. We're still driven by those ancient systems, right? That desire to close the gap between where we are and where we want to be.
Right.
But instead of just focusing on basic needs, like food and shelter, we can set our sights on goals that are much bigger than ourselves.
Like taking the raw materials of survival and using them to fuel our creativity, our desire to make a difference in the world. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, and the AI expert actually leaves us with a final, very thought-provoking question about this whole drive. If these systems are so deeply embedded in us, if they're so fundamental to who we are, what does that say about our constant striving for more?
Is it the source of both our greatest accomplishments and our insatiable desires? Is it a blessing or a curse, or maybe a little bit of both?
It's a question worth pondering, for sure. Perhaps the key is not to try to suppress or deny these drives, but to understand them, to work with them, to harness their power in a way that benefits ourselves and the world around us.
That's a powerful takeaway. Understanding these systems, it's not just about becoming smarter or more successful. It's about using that knowledge to live a more fulfilling, more impactful life.
It's about aligning our actions with our values, finding purpose in our pursuits, and contributing to something larger than ourselves. That's really the essence of thrival.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. Thank you so much for diving deep with us today.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked some new ideas and insights for you. We encourage you to keep exploring these concepts, keep asking questions, and keep striving to thrive in all areas of your life. Until next time.